Throughout all of human history, billions of people were born, lived, and died. All passed through the same dark door that separates this world from the next. All faced the same inevitable destiny that has pursued every human being since Eden. All except two. Elijah was one of them, a man who walked on this earth, breathed the same air you breathe, felt hunger and thirst. A man who knew fear, loneliness, despair. A man who simply never experienced death. Heaven opened and a chariot of fire descended to fetch him. But before understanding why Elijah ascended alive, you need to understand who he really was. And the answer is not simple, because Elijah was not a priest from a noble family with lineage registered in the temple archives. He was not a scribe trained in the rabbinic schools of Jerusalem. He had no political connections or alliances with the royal house. The biblical text presents him abruptly, almost violently in its simplicity. Elijah the Tishbite, from among the inhabitants of Gilead. That's all. No elaborate genealogy, no spiritual resume, no religious pedigree. A man from nowhere, from a rugged mountainous region east of the Jordan. He emerges from anonymity and enters directly into the palace of Israel's most powerful king. Gilead was on the other side of the Jordan, land of shepherds and farmers. Far from the centers of power, distant from the palace intrigues of Samaria. The mountains there were steep, the valleys deep, the people rustic and forgotten. It wasn't the kind of place that produced famous prophets or recognized religious leaders. It was the kind of place that the Samaria establishment completely ignored, and it was exactly from there that God chose to bring forth his spokesman. Elijah appears before Ahab without prior warning, without a letter of introduction, without visible credentials. The first thing that comes out of his mouth is a declaration that defies all the political and religious power of the nation. As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whose presence I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain in these years, except by my word. Try to grasp the audacity of that declaration in its historical context. Ahab had ruled Israel for years with a firm hand and strategic vision. He had a professional army well-trained and equipped with the best weapons of the era. A luxurious palace in Samaria built with cedars from Lebanon and imported ivory. International alliances with neighboring nations that guaranteed peace and trade. He was a skillful politician who expanded borders and built fortified cities. By his side was Jezebel, a Phoenician princess, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon. She was not just any wife waiting in the royal chambers. She was a woman of fierce ambition who brought her religion along with her marriage dowry. 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah now ate at the queen's table. The worship of Abraham's God was being systematically eradicated from the land. The Lord's altars were torn down, turned into rubble and dust. Faithful prophets were hunted like animals and executed without mercy. Obadiah, Ahab's own steward, had hidden 100 prophets in dark caves. He secretly fed them bread and water, risking his own life every day. And in the midst of this scenario of religious persecution and massive national apostasy, an unknown man from the mountains of Gilead enters the royal palace. He announces a drought without asking for an audience, without negotiating terms, without showing fear. He simply declares what will happen and disappears into the night, like smoke that dissipates when you try to catch it with your hands. It didn't rain for 3 years and 6 consecutive months. Drought in the ancient Middle East was not a passing inconvenience. It was a slow-motion death sentence for an entire nation. The first weeks, the shallow wells began to drop dangerously. After a few months, streams that had never dried up turned into beds of stone and sand. The crops yellowed under the relentless sun and withered without hope. The cattle, without green pasture, grew thin until bones showed through their skin. Families began to ration water, then food, finally hope itself. By the end of the first year, food prices skyrocketed to impossible levels. By the end of the second year, people were dying of starvation in the streets. By the end of the third year, the entire nation was on its knees, begging for mercy. And during all that time, the man who declared the drought remained hidden, protected by the same God who shut the heavens like someone closing an iron gate. First, God sent Elijah to the brook of Cherith, east of the Jordan. There, while the nation slowly dried up, the prophet drank fresh water from the stream, and food came from an impossible source that defied all natural logic. Ravens, birds considered unclean by Mosaic law, scavengers by nature. They brought bread and meat in the morning, bread and meat in the evening, every day for endless months without failing a single time. No one knows where this food that kept the prophet alive came from, whether the ravens stole from human tables in nearby villages, whether God created the food from nothing each dawn. The text doesn't explain the mechanism, it merely records the incontestable fact. Ravens feeding a fugitive prophet while a king searched for him to kill him. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. When the brook of Cherith finally dried up for lack of rain, God gave a new instruction that seemed more dangerous than the previous one. Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to sustain you. The irony was brutal and almost cruel in its precision. Zarephath was in Phoenician territory, Jezebel's own homeland, the very nation from which came the queen who wanted Elijah dead. And it was precisely there that God was sending his prophet to hide. Sometimes divine protection works in ways that defy our logic. Hiding in the last place your enemies would think to look. Elijah arrived at the entrance to the city and saw a widow gathering wood. He asked her for water to drink and a piece of bread to eat. Her response was a lament of absolute desperation that froze the blood. As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no baked bread. I only have a handful of flour in the jar and a little oil in the jug. I am gathering 2 sticks to make a final meal for me and my son. We are going to eat it and then die of starvation in this house. Imagine the scene with all its painful and desperate details. A woman skeletal from prolonged hunger, skin stuck to bones. A child with sunken eyes clinging to her ragged and dirty clothing. A few dry sticks in the trembling hands of a desperate mother, and a stranger asking for the little she had left between life and death. Elijah's response seemed cruel, almost inhuman in its demand. Do not fear, go and do as you have said. But make me a small cake first and bring it to me. Afterward make some for you and your son, making first for the stranger when you are about to starve to death with your son. It demands a kind of faith that defies all logic of human survival, a kind of trust that goes against every maternal instinct of protection. But the widow obeyed against all natural reason, and the miracle began in a silent, ordinary, repetitive way. The flour in the jar did not run out during all those months. The oil in the jug never failed a single time, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke through Elijah. For months, that house sustained 3 people with provisions that should have ended in the first week. Each day, the widow opened the jar expecting to find the bottom empty. Each day, she found flour sufficient for 1 more meal. Each day, she uncapped the jug expecting the last drop of oil. Each day she found oil to knead the day's bread. The miracle was not spectacular or flashy like fire from heaven. There were no seas parting or dead being raised before multitudes. It was ordinary, repetitive, silent as the dawn that arrives without announcement, and precisely for that reason, perhaps more impressive than any spectacle. God sustaining 3 people in a foreign pagan city, one day at a time, while the chosen nation died of hunger from its own rebellion. But then the child became gravely ill without apparent cause. The illness worsened rapidly until there was no breath left in him. The child died in his desperate mother's arms. The widow exploded against Elijah with an accusation full of pain and guilt. "What have I to do with you, man of God?" Have you come to remind me of my iniquity and kill my son?" Her theology was typical of the surrounding time and culture. Tragedy meant divine punishment for hidden or known sins. If the prophet was in the house, God must be paying more attention to her faults. Better that he had never appeared at her door, asking for water and bread. Elijah did not discuss systematic theology or give a sermon on God's sovereignty. He took the dead child from her trembling arms. He went up to the upper room where he himself slept each night. He laid the small, motionless body on the bed. And then he did something that had never been recorded before in Scripture. He stretched himself upon the child 3 consecutive times with growing desperation. And he cried out to the Lord with a voice that came from deep within his being. "O Lord my God, I pray that you make the soul of this child return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's voice in that dark room. The child's soul returned to his motionless body. The chest swelled with fresh air again. His eyes opened confused, searching for his mother's face. The child lived and cried out for water. This was the first recorded resurrection in the entire written Bible. It didn't happen in Jerusalem, the holy city where the temple stood. It didn't happen at the altar of sacrifice before the Levitical priests. It happened in a pagan house in enemy Phoenician territory, by the hands of a fugitive prophet considered an enemy of the state, for a foreign widow who had just accused him of killing her son. God doesn't follow predictable scripts or respect established religious protocols. 3 years and 6 complete months, the terrible drought had lasted. It had fulfilled its purpose of getting the attention of a rebellious nation. And then the word of the Lord came to Elijah with new instruction. "Go and present yourself to Ahab, for I will give rain upon the face of the earth." The reunion between the prophet and the king was tense, like a rope about to break. Ahab had searched for Elijah in every surrounding nation and kingdom. He made rulers swear under penalty of death that they didn't know where the prophet was. And now, finally, there he stood before the king as if nothing had happened. The first thing that came out of the king's mouth was an accusation full of contained anger. "Are you the one troubling Israel with your prophecies of destruction?" Elijah's response was direct, without detours or courtly diplomacy. "I have not troubled Israel at all. But you and your father's house with your brazen idolatry, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord to follow the Baals. Now therefore send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, and also the 450 prophets of Baal who eat at Jezebel's table, and the 400 prophets of Asherah whom the queen sustains with the people's money." The challenge was publicly thrown before witnesses of the royal court. Carmel was not chosen by geographic chance or convenience. The mountain range rises dramatically above the blue Mediterranean Sea, visible from kilometers away in all possible directions. It was considered sacred territory, both for worshippers of the Lord and for devotees of Baal. The confrontation would happen on neutral ground before all Israel gathered as witnesses. When the appointed day finally came, thousands climbed the mountain. On one side, 450 prophets of a state religion, sponsored by the queen with unlimited resources from the royal palace, fed with the best food, dressed in fine linen garments, supported by all the government structure and military power. On the other side, a single man from Gilead, known as the Tishbite, wearing a rough, hairy mantle with no visible allies or personal army, with nothing except the word that God had placed in his mouth. Elijah began by confronting the gathered people, not the false prophets. How long will you waver between two conflicting opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him with all your heart. If Baal is God, go after him without looking back. The people did not answer a single word of commitment or conviction. They were paralyzed between two loyalties they could not reconcile, wanting to please God and the king at the same time without offending either, trying to keep one foot in each religion as a safe bet. Elijah did not tolerate this spiritual ambiguity that destroyed true faith. The rules of the challenge were simple and clear to all present. 2 bulls of the same size and age, 2 stone altars. Prepared and dry wood, no human fire permitted under any circumstance. Each side would invoke their god with the prayers and rituals of their religion. Whoever answered with fire from heaven would be recognized as the true God. The people agreed because it was fair and verifiable. The prophets of Baal began their invocation early in the morning. They prepared the altar with large stones, cut the bull with ritual knives. They arranged the wood in perfect order and began to invoke with loud voices. "O Baal, answer us! O Baal, answer us!" The voices echoed through the mountain like distant thunder that brings no rain. They jumped around the altar in a ritual dance that lasted endless hours. The sun rose in the clear sky. Sweat ran down desperate faces. Their voices became hoarse from so much shouting without any response. But there was no voice, nor anyone answering, nor anyone paying attention. At noon, when the sun burned strongest overhead, Elijah began to mock them with irony that cut like a razor. "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Perhaps he is meditating on profound matters of the universe, or he has gone somewhere on important business, or he is on his way back from some meeting with other gods. Perhaps he is sleeping peacefully and needs to be awakened." The mockery was calculated to expose the powerlessness of the mute idol. Each suggestion revealed the absurdity of worshipping wood and stone. If Baal was real and controlled storms and fertility, why couldn't he answer? If he was powerful as his prophets proclaimed, why did he need to be awakened? The prophets intensified the ritual with growing and visible desperation. According to their pagan custom, they cut themselves with knives and sharp lances until they shed abundant blood upon themselves and upon the altar. It was common practice in fertility cults to awaken divine attention. They continued shouting, dancing, bleeding until the hour of the evening sacrifice. Passing noon, approximately 9 hours of frenzied non-stop invocation, 9 hours of exhausting dance under the scorching desert sun, 9 hours of screams that tore throats and cut skin. And the result was exactly the same as at the beginning of the morning. There was no heavenly voice, nor anyone answering from heaven, nor anyone paying the slightest attention to all that bloody spectacle. Then Elijah called the people to come closer to observe. "Come near to me and see what the Lord is going to do." All approached in expectant silence, tired of waiting. The prophet began by repairing the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. He did not build a new altar with stones brought from another place. He restored the ancient one that had been torn down by order of the queen. He used 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. Israel was politically divided into 2 hostile kingdoms, but spiritually before God, it remained one nation. One nation with 12 tribes descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. The stones were a public declaration of indestructible spiritual unity. He made a trench around the altar large enough to contain 2 measures of planted seed. He carefully arranged the wood, cleanly cut up the bull. He placed it on the prepared altar and then did something unexpected, something no one had anticipated or imagined possible. Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood until everything is completely soaked. The order was fulfilled by men who did not understand the purpose. Do it a second time with 4 more jars filled to the brim. They did it a second time without questioning the prophet. Do it a third time until nothing remains dry. They did it a third time before the eyes of thousands of witnesses. 12 jars of water in total poured over altar, wood, and sacrifice. The water ran down all sides, forming little rivers. It ran around the altar and filled the trench to overflowing completely. The wood was soaked as if it had rained for hours. The bull's flesh dripped water mixed with the animal's blood. Any possibility of trickery or hidden fire was publicly eliminated. in a country devastated by 3 complete years of deadly drought, where water was more precious than silver or precious stones. Elijah wasted 12 jars to make the miracle impossible to fake. If God answered now, no one could say it was natural coincidence. Elijah's prayer lasted less than 30 seconds in total. No hysterical screams, no elaborate dances, no bloody self-mutilation. Just direct words addressed to the God who listens in silence. Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are truly God in Israel, and that I am your servant obedient to your voice, and that according to your word I have done all these things. Answer me, Lord, answer me now, so that this people may know that you, Lord, are the true God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you. Fire fell from heaven like concentrated storm lightning. It was not a growing spark that needed time to spread. It was not a gradual flame that required fuel to maintain itself. Fire from heaven descended with incontestable supernatural violence and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the very stones of the altar. It consumed the dust of the earth around and licked up all the water in the trench. Everything disappeared as if it had never existed in that place. The stones turned to ash finer than ground flour. The water evaporated instantly, leaving the earth dry and cracked. The entire altar was consumed as if heaven had erased it. The people saw the fire descend and fell with their faces to the ground, trembling. "The Lord is God! The Lord is truly God!" The confession echoed throughout the mountain like thunder that doesn't cease. 3 years and 6 months of drought, watching the closed sky. 9 hours that same day, watching Baal's prophets fail miserably. 30 seconds of prayer and fire from heaven, answering incontestably. Doubt had nowhere to hide or defend itself with. Elijah gave immediate orders without consulting the present king. Seize the prophets of Baal, let none of them escape. 450 men were captured by the enraged people. They took them to the brook of Kishon in the valley below Carmel. There Elijah executed them all without exception or mercy. It was mass execution, brutal from a modern civilized perspective, but according to Mosaic law that governed Israel by divine mandate. False prophets who led the people astray deserved the death penalty. Elijah was fulfilling what the law clearly commanded, and what the kings had neglected out of cowardice or political convenience. After the execution, Elijah climbed to the summit of Carmel again. He bowed down to the ground, put his face between his knees, and said to his young servant who always accompanied him, "Go up now and look toward the sea on the horizon." The boy went up obediently, looked with attention, returned with his report. There is absolutely nothing visible in the entire clear sky. Elijah sent him back 7 consecutive times to observe. On the 7th time, the servant's answer changed completely. "Behold, a small cloud like a man's palm, rising from the sea toward us slowly." It was sufficient sign for the prophet who knew his God. Elijah sent word to Ahab to go down quickly in his chariot, before the rain stopped him on the muddy road. And while Ahab prepared his royal chariot pulled by swift horses, something extraordinary and supernatural happened again with the prophet. The hand of the Lord came upon Elijah with power that defied nature. He girded up his loins with his mantle to run without stumbling, and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel in the plain. Jezreel was approximately 30 kilometers from Mount Carmel. Elijah ran that entire distance ahead of trained royal horses. A man of advanced age, after a full day of intense confrontation, he surpassed the speed of a chariot pulled by the kingdom's best horses. The strength was not his own, but a temporary gift for a specific purpose. God supernaturally enables when God sends with a clear mission. But what happened in the following hours reveals an important truth. Elijah was not a superman immune to fear or human weakness. Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done that day, and how he had killed all the prophets by the sword without mercy. The queen was not impressed with the fire descended from heaven. She did not bow before the incontestable demonstration of divine power. She sent a messenger to Elijah with a threat that froze the blood. So may the gods do to me, and even more, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of theirs. And the man who faced 450 prophets completely alone, the man who brought down fire from heaven with 30 seconds of prayer, the man who ran faster than royal horses with supernatural power, that same man fled terrified toward the southern desert. He left his servant in Beersheba on the border and continued alone. He walked one more day deeper into the absolute nothingness of the desert. He sat down under a solitary juniper tree and asked to die right there. "It is enough now, Lord. Take my life now, for I am no better than my fathers who died before me." Deep depression after spectacular and incontestable victory. The pattern is more common than it seems in God's servants. Extreme physical exhaustion after prolonged superhuman effort. Violent emotional discharge after tension maintained for years. Unfulfilled expectation that everything would change after Carmel. And now the same queen as before continued in absolute power. With the same bloodlust, the same resources to hunt him down. God did not rebuke the broken prophet in his lowest moment. He did not give a theological sermon about lack of faith or spiritual cowardice. He sent an angel with hot food and fresh water from heaven. "Get up and eat, because you need strength to continue." Elijah ate, drank deeply, and fell asleep under the tree. The angel came back a second time with more heavenly provision. "Get up and eat, because the journey ahead of you is very long." Elijah ate and drank again with recovered appetite, and with the strength from that supernatural food from heaven. He walked 40 days and 40 complete nights without stopping, until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God in the desert. Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai, where it all began, the same place where Moses saw the burning bush that was not consumed, the same place where Israel received the law engraved in stone, the most sacred place in all of Israel's history up to that moment. And it was there in a dark cave that God found his broken prophet. The question came direct without detours or diplomatic preambles. "What are you doing here, Elijah, hiding in this cave?" The response was an outpouring of self-pity and perceived loneliness. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your sacred covenant. They have torn down your altars until not one stone remains on another. They have killed your prophets by the sword without any pity. Only I am left alive, and now they seek to take my life too." God did not respond with words of comfort or immediate correction. He responded with a demonstration of power that would shake the prophet's soul. "Go out of the cave and stand on this mountain before my presence." And behold, the Lord passed by with a terrible manifestation. A great and powerful wind that tore the mountains apart like paper. It broke the rocks before the Lord with unimaginable violence. The earth trembled, dust rose in dense clouds. The noise was deafening like 1,000 concentrated storms, but the Lord was not in the wind, however powerful it was. After the wind, an earthquake that shook the foundations. The ground trembled beneath the frightened prophet's feet. The cave swayed like a ship in a furious storm. Stones fell from the heights, striking the ground. But the Lord was not in the earthquake, however violent it was. After the earthquake, fire consuming everything in its path. Flames devoured the dry vegetation around the mountain, intense heat that burned the very air he breathed, blinding light that made it impossible to keep eyes open. But the Lord was not in the fire, however impressive it was, and after the fire came something completely unexpected, a gentle and soft voice like the whisper of a gentle breeze, a silence that spoke louder than all the tempests. A stillness that penetrated deeper than any earthquake. Elijah covered his face with his mantle reverently and went out to the entrance of the cave to listen. The question was repeated exactly the same as before. "What are you doing here, Elijah, after all you have seen?" The response was identical word for word without any change. Elijah had not yet learned anything from the manifestation. He remained trapped in the same self-pity and distorted perception. But God continued with specific and concrete instructions. "Go, return by your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive there, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Syria, and Jehu son of Nimshi you shall anoint as king over Israel itself, and Elisha son of Shaphat you shall anoint as prophet in your place." 3 anointings that would change the course of history. 3 instruments of judgment against the corrupt house of Ahab. Elijah was not alone, fighting impossible battles without help. God had a plan that involved nations, kings, and a successor. And then came the direct correction of false self-pity. "Also I have left in Israel 7,000 people faithful, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him in idolatrous worship. 7,000 faithful whom Elijah did not know or had seen, 7,000 who maintained the faith in silence while he thought he was alone." The loneliness he felt was emotionally real in his heart, but it was completely false from the perspective of facts. God always preserves a faithful remnant in the midst of apostasy. Elijah descended from the mountain with a new mission and corrected perspective. He found Elisha plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in the field. The young man worked with the 12th yoke personally. Prosperous family with abundant resources and assured future. Guaranteed work inheriting his father's land. Economic stability and respect in the local community. Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle over his shoulders. He did not say a single word of explanation or invitation. Just the prophetic gesture loaded with eternal significance. Elisha understood immediately, without need for additional words. He left the oxen abandoned in the middle of the furrow. He ran after Elijah with a decision that admitted no doubt. He asked only to be able to say goodbye to his parents before leaving. Elijah's response was enigmatic and challenging. "Go back. What have I done to you?" It was not formal permission or authoritarian prohibition. It was a test of commitment that demanded a free personal decision. The divine call requires a voluntary response without external coercion. Elisha returned to his father's house, but not to stay comfortably. He took the yoke of oxen he had just used and sacrificed them. He cooked the meat using the wood from the farming implements and gave it to the gathered people to eat as a final farewell. Then he rose with absolute determination and followed Elijah, serving him faithfully in everything the prophet needed. The gesture was definitive and completely irreversible. He sacrificed the oxen that were his main work tool. He burned the plow that was his means of guaranteed livelihood. He fed the entire community as a farewell celebration. There remained no possibility whatsoever of returning to his former life. Elisha burned the bridges, literally and symbolically, that day. For years that the text does not specifically detail, Elisha served Elijah, learning from the Master silently, observing every movement, listening to every wise word, waiting patiently for his moment designated by God. And when the prophesied final day finally arrived, Elisha knew deep in his spirit that something extraordinary would happen. 2 Kings chapter 2 narrates the final hours with the precision of an eyewitness who saw everything directly. Elijah and Elisha departed together from Gilgal toward an unknown destination. Elijah tried to leave Elisha behind on 3 different occasions. "Stay here, I pray you, for the Lord sends me to Bethel." Elisha firmly refused to abandon his beloved master. "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you alone." They went together to Bethel, walking in heavy silence. The sons of the prophets who lived there came out to meet them, with a difficult question loaded with anticipated pain. Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from over your head? Elisha already knew it in his broken heart. Yes, I know it perfectly. Be silent and speak no more. In Bethel, Elijah again tried to leave his disciple behind. Elisha, stay here now, for the Lord sends me to Jericho. Elisha repeated his refusal with the same iron determination. As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you. They went together to Jericho under a sky that seemed heavier. The sons of the prophets of Jericho asked the identical painful question. Elisha gave the identical curt response, asking for silence. In Jericho, the third and final attempt at separation, stay here because the Lord sends me to the Jordan. For the third consecutive time, Elisha refused to stay behind. As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will never leave you. 50 men of the sons of the prophets followed them. They stopped at a distance, watching from a safe distance. Elijah and Elisha finally arrived at the bank of the Jordan. The river ran full and rushing as always at that time. With no visible bridge, no available boat to cross, Elijah took his distinctive mantle, rolled it up firmly, and struck the waters with incontestable prophetic authority. The Jordan divided completely toward one side and the other, forming a wall of water to the right and left miraculously. The two men passed on dry ground through the exposed riverbed, the same river that opened for Joshua centuries earlier, when all Israel entered the promised land to conquer it. Now it opened again for two men only, one who was definitively departing toward eternal heaven, another who would return to continue the unfinished mission. On the other side of the river on dry land, Elijah asked the most crucial question of all. Ask what you want me to do for you before I am taken away. Elisha did not ask for material wealth or political influence. He did not ask for long life or protection against mortal enemies. He asked for something much more valuable and difficult to obtain. I pray you that a double portion of your spirit be upon me, in the Israelite inheritance law established by Moses. The firstborn son received a double portion of the paternal inheritance. Elisha was asking for recognition as the legitimate spiritual heir. As firstborn in the faith and official successor of the ministry, it was not spiritual greed, but profound understanding of the calling. Elijah's response was completely honest and direct. You have asked a difficult thing that is not in my power to grant. However, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be granted to you by the Lord himself. But if you do not see me depart, it will not be given to you. The condition was not capricious or arbitrary at all. Seeing the rapture would require total, uninterrupted attention, eyes fixed on the Master until the last possible second. It was a final test of focus, absolute priority, iron determination. The two continued walking together, conversing calmly, two men on an apparently common and ordinary afternoon, walking along the banks of the Jordan as so many times before. Master and disciple, prophet departing and prophet remaining, and then, without prior warning or anticipated sign, something happened that had never before occurred in human history. A chariot of fire with horses of fire appeared suddenly, violently separating them from each other in a fraction of a second. Elijah began to ascend to heaven in the midst of a terrible whirlwind. It was not gradual or smooth like ascending in a balloon. It was violent, supernatural, impossible according to known natural laws. Heavenly fire spinning in an irresistible ascending spiral. Horses that were not of flesh galloping upward, a whirlwind that tore the very air with a deafening roar. And in the exact center of all that unleashed power, a man from Gilead being carried alive toward eternity. Elisha saw every detail engraving itself in his memory forever. He cried out with a voice that came from the deepest part, my Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." The cry was recognition of the prophet's inestimable value. Elijah was worth more for the true defense of all Israel than the entire professional army of the king with its chariots. A single man with direct access to the Almighty God was more powerful than 1,000 well-equipped war chariots. Elijah's distinctive mantle fell floating gently, while the prophet continued ascending toward heavenly glory. Elisha caught it reverently with trembling hands. He tore his own garments in two parts as a sign, traditional sign of deep mourning for irreparable loss. But immediately he took the inherited mantle from the master and returned walking alone toward the bank of the Jordan. The 50 prophets were still watching from a distance, waiting to see what would happen with the solitary disciple. Elisha arrived at the edge of the running water. He struck the waters with Elijah's mantle firmly. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah now?" The waters of the Jordan divided exactly the same, forming a solid wall to right and left again. Elisha passed on completely dry land without getting wet. The sons of the prophets saw from afar and understood. The spirit of Elijah definitely rests upon Elisha. They came to meet him walking quickly and bowed before him to the ground with reverence. The transition was complete and undeniably confirmed. The prophetic mantle had passed to worthy hands. The sacred mission continued under new anointed leadership. But the question continues resonating through 3 millennia. Why was Elijah taken alive without experiencing death? What deep meaning does that unique event have? Theologians, historians, and scholars propose varied answers. Some point to the incontestable public testimony given. Elijah lived in an era of almost total apostasy, when the vast majority abandoned the true faith. He remained absolutely firm without compromising anything. The rapture was a visible public declaration that radical faithfulness has glorious eternal consequences. Elisha saw it with his own physical eyes. The 50 prophets were direct eyewitnesses. The record was carefully preserved by scribes, so that future generations would know without a doubt that God powerfully honors those who faithfully honor him. Others point to the clearly prophesied future mission. The prophet Malachi, writing 400 years later, recorded a specific promise from the Lord himself. "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet. Before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes, he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their broken fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse." Jewish tradition takes this literally without metaphors. Elijah will return bodily before the end times. In every annual Passover celebration to this day, a chair remains empty, reserved for the expected prophet. A cup of wine is filled, but no one drinks it. The door opens symbolically toward the dark night. Perhaps this will be the night when Elijah finally returns. Christian tradition sees in John the Baptist partial fulfillment. Jesus clearly affirmed in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 11, "And if you are willing to receive it, he is that Elijah who was to come." John came with the spirit and power of Elijah revived. He dressed in rough camel's hair like the Tishbite. He ate locusts and wild honey from the desert. He confronted kings without fear of mortal consequences. He prepared the way of the Lord, crying out in the wilderness. But John died beheaded in a dark prison. Whether it was complete or partial fulfillment remains debated. There is also the extraordinary episode of the Transfiguration, complete centuries after the rapture at the Jordan. On a high mountain apart from noisy crowds, Jesus took with him only Peter, James, and John. There he was transfigured before them visibly. His face shone bright as the noonday sun. His garments became white, radiant as pure light. And 2 men appeared conversing with him familiarly, Moses, who died on Mount Nebo centuries earlier, and Elijah, the man who ascended in a whirlwind of fire, the one who was taken alive without tasting death. He descended again in a temporary and specific way, to converse with Jesus about his upcoming departure. That would happen in Jerusalem through cross and resurrection. Moses represented the law given at Sinai. Elijah represented all the prophets who spoke. Both testified publicly before 3 disciples that this man from Nazareth was exactly the one to whom all sacred history pointed. The fulfillment of promises made from ancient times. Some scholars go further in careful speculation. Hebrews chapter 11 lists heroes of true faith and affirms that all died without receiving fulfilled promises. But Elijah did not die physically like all of them, nor Enoch, who was also translated without seeing death. Revelation chapter 11 mentions 2 future witnesses who will prophesy for exactly 1,260 days with supernatural power to completely shut the heaven so that no rain falls during the time of their prophecy. Exactly the same thing Elijah did in Israel. Would Elijah and Enoch be the 2 witnesses of the end time? The only 2 men who never experienced physical death? Will they return to complete a pending prophetic mission? Speculation continues among sincere believers. But what we know with absolute certainty is limited. A completely ordinary man from a despised region was called by God for an extraordinary, impossible mission. He confronted the most powerful religious system of his era. He accomplished the impossible on Mount Carmel before thousands. He fled terrified toward the desert from a woman's threat. He was completely restored by God on Mount Sinai. He trained his successor with patience for years, and on a specific day, recorded by a faithful witness, before eyes that saw and recorded everything in detail. He ascended alive toward heaven without leaving a body behind. The Apostle James, in a New Testament letter, makes special emphasis on his shared humanity. Elijah was a man subject to passions like ours. The Greek word for passions means human weaknesses, natural limitations, uncontrollable emotions, paralyzing fears. Elijah felt fear that completely froze his blood. Elijah fell into deep depression after victories. Elijah felt alone when thousands remained faithful, and even so, when he prayed with simple faith. Heaven itself obeyed his broken human voice. To this day, after 3,000 years, secular historians and believing theologians debate the meaning of that inexplicable event on the banks of the Jordan. Jewish tradition hopefully awaits the prophet's return before the great final day of divine judgment. Christian tradition sees fulfillment in John the Baptist, though it recognizes the possibility of additional future fulfillment. Secular scholars seek impossible naturalistic explanations, but the carefully recorded facts remain unalterable. A man walked on this earth for decades. He confronted powerful kings without armies to back him up. He challenged religious empires with only his prophetic word, and on a specific day, before a reliable eyewitness, who recorded every detail for generations to come, he disappeared toward heaven without leaving a body for burial. The mantle fell floating gently toward dry ground. The prophet ascended wrapped in fire and heavenly whirlwind, and 3,000 years after that extraordinary day, his name is still pronounced with profound reverence at Jewish Passover tables around the entire world, with an empty chair waiting for his promised return, with a filled cup that no one drinks awaiting the guest, with a door open toward the dark night of the world, hoping that perhaps this will finally be the night when the Tishbite from Gilead crosses the threshold again. Some stories do not end with a definitive period. They merely remain suspended awaiting future fulfillment, like prophecies written on preserved ancient parchment, awaiting the day designated from the foundation of the world, to reveal their complete and glorious meaning. When heaven is completely silent to our cry, it is not because God is absent or indifferent to pain. It is because he wants to be heard in profound silence, where his soft voice penetrates deeper than tempests and transforms broken hearts into useful vessels again. Elijah was not raptured because he was perfect without flaws. He was raptured because he remained faithful despite flaws, because when everyone else bowed the knee before idols, he stood firm even though he trembled with fear, because true faith is not the absence of human weakness. It is trusting God precisely in the midst of weakness. It is believing when everything indicates you should give up. It is remaining when logic advises fleeing quickly. It is praying one more time when previous ones were not answered. It is hoping against all visible earthly hope. If today you find yourself in your own desert of loneliness, thinking you are the only one who remains faithful still, remember that God always preserves a hidden remnant, 7,000 knees that never bowed under pressure, 7,000 mouths that refuse to kiss what is false. And also remember that the same God who sent angels with hot bread and fresh water for an exhausted prophet still provides for his broken servants today, not always with visible supernatural spectacles, but with sufficient grace for one more day of journey. Write in the comments a single word that summarizes what God spoke to your heart through this story, one word that captures the renewed hope or the profound conviction that was born while you listened. May your word be a declaration of living faith. Elijah ascended, but his mantle fell for another. The mission never depended on a single mortal man. God always has a plan of generational continuity. He always prepares successors for work that does not end, until all promises are completely fulfilled. And when your final day designated from eternity arrives, when your race is complete and your mission fulfilled, may you depart knowing that the mantle was passed to faithful hands that will continue what you began, because the kingdom of God advances from generation to generation. He did not explain all the suffering endured in the desert. He did not give theological answers to every question formulated. He simply revealed himself in the midst of inexplicable pain. And that revelation of his presence was sufficient to transform desperation into eternally renewed hope.